There are some members of the finance team that will come down and take a seat. If there are any technical questions or anything straight afterwards that you still need explained, they can do that.
Cool. Well, should be coming straight down.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, what time are you on?
Go for it, that's ready.
Test, test. Hello, hello, hello. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, li, la, da, ti, do. All good?
What's that? New stress ball. Happy ball. Stress.
Blissfully happy.
Blissfully.
We're out now at 10-2 this week.
Couple of years ago somewhere. You were only a couple.
Is it just Goff?
No, that's just Desley.
Who else?
You can just stand. Who is it? Desley Simpson, who chairs the.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Oh, those lights are bright. We're just waiting for Councillor Simpson, and we'll get underway. Sorry to keep you waiting. Is it still raining outside? Ready to roll? Yeah. Step right next to me. Yeah. Now that we're out of COVID, we don't have to socially distance, so
You're not too close.
politically close but socially distant, is that right? Look, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We've just passed our budget, which is not simply an annual budget this year, but an emergency budget. It was passed overwhelmingly by 18 votes to 3. This is a budget that was an exceptional budget for unprecedented times. First of all, the impact of COVID-19 was to leave a $500 million hole in our budget, and it's not easy to fill a $500 million hole. Last year, we had to achieve that to future-proof the City Rail link, and that emptied almost all the buckets that Council had. This year, we didn't have much to fall back on, and that meant that we had to take pretty dramatic steps to keep our budget where there was a pathway back to balance between our income and our expenditure. Were that not enough, we then had, post our consultation period, a clear requirement to invest another $239 million, nearly $250 million, to create the infrastructure to provide water for this city, to try to ward off the risk of severe water constraints in the coming summer. It wasn't an easy task, but councillors, all 21 of us, I believe, engaged constructively and in a collaborative way to find a way through the challenges that budget situation faced. It wasn't a case of simply being able to borrow more money. Because we're a high growth city, we have borrowed really to the maximum extent of prudential borrowing, keeping below the debt to revenue ratio set by our credit rating agencies. Why did we borrow? Because we needed the infrastructure to match the growth. There was a deficit of infrastructure. We had lagged behind, leaving a trail of traffic congestion, housing shortage and unaffordability, and lack of environmental protections. So we couldn't simply borrow, though for the immediate period of time we will spend above the debt to revenue ratio, probably rising to 290%. We do so on the advice that the credit rating agencies will look at the situation of the crisis that we faced, look at the fact we had a credible plan to get back within the debt to revenue ratio, and that we were managing our finances sensibly. To compensate for the $500 million loss, we would have had to have raised rates by 28%. That was never a consideration by us. We also had to look at trimming our spending. Trimming is a euphemism. We had to slash our spending in some areas. Firstly, we have cut council spending by over $200 million for the coming year. We have had to lose staff. 600 contingency workers already no longer with us, and notice to be given to another full-time equivalent of 500 jobs on council. That is incredibly tough, and that also affects our ability to deliver services in the way we wanted to. We've had to trim, and I can use that word in this context, trim back our investment in infrastructure. We were due to spend $2.7 billion on infrastructure this year. That's an enormous amount. It compares to an average of $1.6 billion over the last 5 years. We have trimmed it back, but we will still spend, including on the water care projects, $2.5 billion this year. The easy answer would have been to slash our infrastructure spending. We decided not to do that. Why not? Because we have a pressing need to get that infrastructure done, and there's no better time to work hard to build infrastructure than when your community is going into recession. We can create lasting assets for the people of Auckland. We can keep jobs going. We can keep the pipeline of work open for the construction industry. If we closed that, we would be years behind our program, and we can help stimulate economic activity. The last lever we pulled was to sell surplus properties. Some people say it's asset sales. An asset is something that is useful for you. The assets, the so-called assets that we're selling, are basically property that we have no use for at the moment and no foreseeable use for at the moment. Therefore, it costs us money to keep it, and there's an opportunity cost of not using that money for capital projects. So we have taken a decision in this budget that uses all of those levers. We consulted on rates rises, and there were more people in favour of 2.5 than 3.5. We struggled with that decision, but the evidence was very clear that if we were to take the lower rate rise, we would move to cutting to the bone the services that we have to provide to the people of Auckland, that they need, not nice to have services, but essential services, and we would have had to have cut our capital infrastructure program by over $200 million actually. And when we weighed it up, the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of councillors decided that we would damage the services and damage our investment in the future if we took the lower rate rise. We have 21 local boards. They were all consulted. For the first time, I think, in the history of this council, they were unanimous. They were unanimous, whether they were from the north or east of the city or the west and the south of the city, that we needed a 3.5% rate rise, and that's what we've put in. For those people suffering hardship, we've set aside $50 million in rates postponement. Those are the people for whom COVID-19 has hit them hard, loss of jobs, loss of income, loss of businesses. And we are not going to foreclose on anyone's property in that situation. We're going to give them the chance to get back on their feet by postponing the rates that they owe. I think we've balanced the needs of equity, the needs of being an inclusive city. We've kept the material in for the living wage, for climate change, for dealing with homelessness, for achieving better Māori outcomes. We have acted in a financially prudent way. We have kept our key services intact, and most of all, we have kept the investment in the infrastructure for this city's future going in a way that will help economic recovery. I think it's a good budget. I want to thank Councillor Desley Simpson, who chaired the Finance and Performance Committee, did a absolutely superb job, was totally inclusive. Nobody criticised the process that we followed, and we owe a lot to you, Desley. Is there anything that you would like to add to my comments?
Look, I think you've said it all. I think for me, I started at zero. If you don't know the true facts of council's figures, you say, well, we shouldn't have a rates rise at all. But if you really understand how that actually impacts on what we do, then you have to look at some form of rates rise. So then I went to 2.5%. I thought, let's go as low as we can. The mayor was on 3.5%. I wanted to bring it down to 2.5%, and we went out for consultation around that. When that consultation came back, yes, the one that I looked at was the Colmar-Brunton. Of all the responses, I looked at the Colmar-Brunton, which had asked all the right questions, gave all the right information, and the result of that was that people were prepared to take a 2.5% rates rise. That is before we had the drought problem, and we needed to do something about that. So I want to congratulate the Mayor for going down to the Waikato and dealing with our supply issue. Trouble is, he came back with a $224 million price tag, which is another $250 million. So there was no way that we could deal with that, in my opinion, competently at 2.5. So it had to be recalibrated yet again. I want to congratulate the finance team who've done about 33 versions of this budget. So at the end of the day, 3.5 against 2.5, what's the difference? It deals with our drought problem. It stops peak public transport fares going up. It keeps our super gold card people being able to use public transport. And it keeps our libraries open. And it does things that mean a lot to local boards and local communities. We've actually included a little bit extra so that local boards are able to have a budget of their own to spend locally, because every community will be different. In some communities, they really need some grants to organisations who help their community. In some, they need that extra money to employ people. Some use that extra money to deliver services and assets and things within, little transport things. Local boards have lost a lot. They've lost a lot of money out of their budget. Every budget line has taken a cut. So for me, there really wasn't a choice. It had to be 3.5. And I realise it's painful. It's painful for everybody, which is why our priority, in fact, one of the first things we did, Your Worship, wasn't it, was to develop a second rates remission postponement scheme. We already have one, but we actually put another one together because we realised that this particular one would help people up to $20,000 of rates who were in hardship. So look, it's not perfect, but we don't live in a perfect world. COVID-19 is not over, and nor are the economic impacts of COVID-19 on both council and our wider Auckland. But I think my passion was to make sure that we kept investing, we kept people have the ability to work in our city, and to keep our infrastructure development going, because we are well behind anyway. And the risk of stopping now for even a year was too great for the outcome. So that's why I supported 3.5%.
Thank you. We'll move to questions. You'll see that the council is made up of people from a variety of different political backgrounds. Desley and mine is not exactly the same. We left, as we always do in council actually, our political differences behind us. We worked pragmatically to find a good solution that best meets and serves the interests of our people in the city. And people came from every different background, and they came together and they coalesced around a set of decisions that I believe are evidence-driven, not ideologically driven. They're pragmatic answers to a pretty serious situation, made worse by the fact that COVID-19 could come back, as we've seen it come back in Melbourne. That would be a huge hammer blow to the country and to the city. So we've kept a contingency in our budget to make sure we can cope with a situation that might be unexpected, as exactly the way the water situation was, and the need for that extra infrastructure build. Okay, open it up for questions.
Can you please explain what not raising rates by 3.5% would mean to an Aucklander in terms of the way they usually interact with council? I'm talking like public transport, parks, pools, libraries, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, there's a series of things that we would have to have cut if we were to have a lower level of rate increase. It added up to about $200 million worth of infrastructure projects that wouldn't have been continued or wouldn't have even been started, and would have left the city in the situation of that deficit of transport, of environmental services, of housing infrastructure. And it would have slashed another $17-18 million from our budgets. It would, for example, the examples that Councillor Simpson used, we would have had to have cut library hours. We would have had to have probably not mown our parks on a regular enough basis. We probably would have had to have removed litter bins. A whole lot of small but meaningful things that make our city a better place to be in. And councillors looked at that and they said, well, you know, the difference between 2.5% and 3.5% rates rise for the person with $1 million home, the average ratepayer is about 47 cents a week for that person. But the difference for council in being able to deliver key services and to continue to invest in the future was great.
Do the late and unexpected costings from water care raise questions about the quality of oversight and communication between council and water care?
Well, first of all, the cause of the water situation and the risk of severe water constraints this coming summer are driven by a 1 in 200 year drought. We have a further forecast, despite the weather today. Every day I wake up and pray for rain. Despite the weather at the moment, we have a projected water shortage because of a dry spring and summer. So if the question is, could we have predicted that? Well, I don't think anybody much did. Could we have got the information earlier from Watercare? The answer is probably yes. If we had that information earlier, we could have included that within our consultation process, and that, I think, would have influenced the way people thought about, you know, the difference between 2.5 and 3.5, for example.
Is it because the council didn't ask, or did they resist giving it?
No, look, I think traditionally Watercare is set up as a CCO operated at arm's length. I don't think that council focus on strategy for water delivery was as strong as it needed to be, and we're tackling that problem now. I don't think it was wise for Watercare to keep council at arm's length as it did, and we're repairing that situation. We now have a Watercare liaison councillor that sits in on their board meetings. They come before our CCO Oversight Committee, but most particularly with this impending crisis, I've been dealing with them on a day-to-day basis. That's the way the relationship should be, and that's the way the relationship will be for the future. It needs to be much closer, our oversight needs to be much better, And Watercare itself needs to think more strategically, particularly in light of the problems with climate change and the greater frequency of droughts that will follow that.
Can you just quickly confirm it's about $100 per household for the 3.5% increase? Is that right?
The difference between a 2.5% and a 3.5% increase adds up to about 47 cents a week. I think that's correct.
But a 3.5% increase is about $100 per
Oh, the total, the effect of a 3.5%, I think it's roughly in that order. Ross, can you give me a specific figure?
From the top of mind, we're about 120, 130.
Okay, that's about the difference that it will make, the whole 3.5. I noticed that there was a shock headline in the paper today, but I read through to councillors today the proposed rate increases for all the major cities in New Zealand. I think Auckland's were the lowest.
If I can ask Councillor Simpson, while you were preparing this extraordinary budget, then you had to tack on an extra $244 million when you got the bill from Watercare. What was your reaction to that?
I don't think it would be appropriate for me. I'm trying to think of the right words. It was a huge shock, you know, but more importantly, we needed the supply, you know. So as I said, I was really grateful that the Mayor got the supply. Wasn't so grateful when I saw the price tag that was with it. So look, it was tough, but I wasn't going to sit here as a governor of Auckland and let our region run out of water. And for me, that was the deal breaker, quite simply.
There won't be an Aucklander around that thinks that we shouldn't invest in that infrastructure to make sure that we can reduce the risk of severe water constraints. After COVID-19, the last thing we need to do is close industry for several days a week because we can't provide it with water. The last thing we want is for households to go without. So we've had to pull every lever there. We've encouraged a reduction in demand. And in saying that, I just want to note that Aucklanders have the second lowest per capita consumption of water in the country, but we've also had to provide a greater supply. Where does those costs come from? It's about $145 million to expand the water treatment plant at Tuakau, and another $57 million to build a new water treatment plant at the Hayes Creek Dam in Papakura.
Mr. Goff, when will people know what particular infrastructure projects you will curtail, and when will some of your staff know this extra 500? When will they know if they've still got a job?
The question of staffing, if I take that first, that's a matter for the acting chief executive officer, and she's got a pretty tough task, unenviable, to tell people that have served their council well that because of the situation we find ourselves in, their job has gone. In terms of the infrastructure projects, there'll be a government announcement, I think, this Saturday that will specify the two sets of $98 million in funding that we'll get under shovel ready. That will be very welcome. Half of that wasn't in our budget, so it won't affect our budgetary considerations. Half of it was, so that has enabled us to put things back, like the $40 million that would otherwise not be there for road safety infrastructure, such as dealing with rebuilding dangerous intersections. Another $32 million, I think, would have come out of our capital works program. So by and large, our capital works program will look really healthy this year. And that is about investing in the future. That is about generating jobs. That is about stimulating economic recovery. We wanted to do all of those things.
When did the extra 500 staff, 500 or so staff, when will they find out?
I think it'll be spread over a period of time, but that's a decision that's in the hands of the chief executive, not the governing body.
They haven't been informed as of yet?
They know the figure. They know some of the areas. I think they'll work area by area, and it is a tough decision. But we all accept that council will need to be a leaner and a smaller organisation for the future.
If I can ask, for the average Aucklander, what will this slashing of spending mean for them? If you could give some couple of concrete examples with me, delayed recycling.
Well, the way we've worked it, what it won't mean for them is a loss of the essential services that they've enjoyed. I'll give you just one example. Until COVID-19 came along, I didn't realise how well used our city libraries were. You know, there's 500,000 people each week that use our libraries. We wanted to preserve that, but we still would have had to have trimmed hours around the edges. The way that we have worked this budget through is that there will not be a reduction in opening hours for libraries now. People would have people would have noticed it in a whole lot of ways. I mean, it would have been, they would have noticed it in the maintenance of our parks and reserves. They would have noticed it in the reduction of public transport services, a whole series of things that would have affected people's lives. I travel by private car, but the last thing I wanted to do was to reduce public transport services, which would mean more cars on the road. So everybody would have been affected by those cuts in some way. What we have managed to do is we've trimmed where we can, but we have kept the essential services going.
But as it stands, there are going to be differences to services, surely. A couple of examples.
Yeah.
What is actually going to change?
Yeah, look, there will be differences in the level of services that are provided. I'm just trying to think, because we've put a certain amount of money back into the budget now that we would otherwise have to have cut out. But just ask Kevin for a couple of examples of the things that will still be affected by the remaining cuts.
Yeah, we are talking about things like reduced maintenance programs. We just put those back to the cleaning and maintenance around our reserves and town centres. Hopefully still to a level that will maintain them properly, but people may notice a reduction in those maintenance levels.
So that's one example, but it could have been much more severe. Right. No further questions? Some of you have got deadlines to meet, so thank you very much for attending. And if there's any further questions, just get in touch with my office or Desley.